Good evening, dear listener. Welcome back to another peaceful journey through history, where we explore the quieter moments of the past together. Tonight we're going to travel back in time to a very specific day in French history, not one filled with drama or excitement, but rather a day that began like many others, with the soft rustle of silk curtains and the gentle morning light filtering through tall palace windows. Take a moment now to settle into your most comfortable position, perhaps adjust your pillow, pull your blanket a little closer, and let your breathing slow down naturally. Tonight's story is about Marie Antoinette's final day as Queen of France, but we won't be focusing on the dramatic events you might expect. Instead, we'll explore the small human moments, the way sunlight looked on marble floors, the sound of footsteps in long corridors, the texture of fabric, and the simple rituals that made up a day in the life of the last Queen of France. As we begin this gentle journey together, allow your mind to wander back to October 14th, 1793, to a time when the world moved more slowly, when letters were written by candlelight, and when the simple act of dressing in the morning was a careful, deliberate ceremony. Let the soft cadence of this story carry you toward peaceful dreams, where history becomes a lullaby, and the past feels as gentle as a whisper. Close your eyes if you haven't already, and let us begin. The morning of October 14th, 1793, began much like the previous mornings had for Marie Antoinette, though the circumstances were vastly different from her days at Versailles. Gone were the elaborate morning ceremonies, the dozens of attendants, and the ritual of the lever that had once marked the beginning of each royal day. Instead, dawn broke quietly over the Conciergerie prison in Paris, where the former Queen of France had been held since August. The stone walls of her cell were thick and cold, built centuries earlier when this place had been a medieval palace. Now it served as a prison, but the morning light still found its way through the small barred window, casting gentle patterns on the rough stone floor. Marie Antoinette had grown accustomed to these patterns over the weeks of her imprisonment, the way the light shifted throughout the day, creating a natural clock that marked the passage of time in her confined world. She had always been an early riser, even in the grandest days of Versailles, and this morning was no different. The habits of a lifetime don't disappear overnight, and so she found herself awake before dawn, sitting quietly on the simple wooden chair that served as one of the few pieces of furniture in her cell. The silence of the early morning was profound, quite different from the bustling activity that had always surrounded her as queen, but peaceful in its own way. The cell itself was spartanly furnished. Besides the wooden chair, there was a simple bed with rough linens, a small table, and a washstand. The walls were bare stone, interrupted only by the window and the heavy wooden door. It was a far cry from the silk-lined chambers of Versailles, with their gilded mirrors and delicate furniture, but there was something almost monastic about the simplicity that brought its own kind of peace. Marie Antoinette had spent many of these early morning hours in quiet reflection, thinking about her children, her husband, and the life that had brought her to this moment. But rather than dwelling on regrets or fears, she found herself often remembering the small beautiful moments, the way morning light had looked in the Hall of Mirrors, the sound of her daughter's laughter echoing through the palace gardens, the scent of roses from the Petit Trianon. As the light grew stronger, she could hear the sounds of the prison beginning to stir, footsteps in the corridors, the quiet conversations of guards, the distant sound of doors opening and closing. These sounds had become the soundtrack of her days, as familiar now as the court music that had once filled her ears. She had learned to find comfort in routine, even in circumstances so different from anything she had ever known. The morning air was crisp for October, and she could feel the coolness even within the stone walls of the Conciergerie. She pulled her simple shawl closer around her shoulders, a plain woolen garment that bore no resemblance to the elaborate robes she had once worn, but which provided warmth and comfort nonetheless. There was something to be said for the practicality of simple clothing, she had discovered. No need for assistance in dressing, no complicated layers or delicate fabrics that required careful handling. Through her window, she could see a small section of the courtyard below. It wasn't much of a view, but it was enough to remind her of the world beyond these walls. Sometimes birds would perch on the windowsill, and she had grown fond of watching them. They were free to come and go as they pleased, and there was something soothing about their presence, their simple existence unmarked by the complexities of human affairs. The morning routine in the conciergerie was predictable, which had its own comfort. Soon she knew, someone would bring her simple breakfast, perhaps some bread and water, maybe a bit of cheese if she was fortunate. It was plain fare, but she had learned to appreciate it for what it was: sustenance, simply prepared and honestly presented. There was no need for elaborate presentation or ceremony. The food served its purpose, and that was enough. She had been reflecting lately on how different her relationship with food had become. At Versailles, meals had been elaborate affairs, with dozens of courses and strict protocols governing every aspect of dining. The royal table had been a stage for displaying wealth and power, with each dish carefully chosen not just for taste but for its symbolic meaning. Now eating had returned to its most basic function: nourishment for the body, consumed in quiet simplicity. The light continued to grow stronger, and Marie Antoinette found herself thinking about this day that was beginning. She had no way of knowing what it would bring, but she approached it with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through all the mornings of her imprisonment. There was something to be said for taking each day as it came, for finding peace in the present moment rather than worrying about what might lie ahead. She had always been someone who noticed small details: the way light fell on fabric, the sound of footsteps on different surfaces, the particular scent of flowers in different seasons. These observational skills, which had once helped her navigate the complex social world of Versailles, now served her in a different way. They helped her find small pleasures even in the most constrained circumstances: the way the morning light revealed the texture of the stone wall, the sound of birds calling to each other in the distance, the feeling of the simple wooden chair beneath her hands. As the morning progressed, she could hear more activity in the prison around her. The conciergerie was not a quiet place during the day, but the early morning hours had a special quality of stillness that she had learned to treasure. It was during these quiet moments that she felt most connected to herself, to the person she had been before all the titles and ceremonies, before the revolution had changed everything. The woman who sat in that simple wooden chair, watching the morning light shift across the stone floor, was still Marie Antoinette, but she was also something more basic and essential: a human being facing an uncertain future with whatever grace and dignity she could muster. The elaborate court dress was gone, the jewels and crowns had been taken away, but the core of who she was remained intact. And so the morning of October 14, 1793, began quietly, with simple light and simple sounds, marking the start of what would be the last day that Marie Antoinette would wake up as the Queen of France, though she did not know it yet. The day stretched ahead of her like all the others, filled with the ordinary moments that make up a life, regardless of the circumstances in which that life unfolds. As the morning light grew stronger in Marie Antoinette's cell, she began her daily routine with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized her life at Versailles, though the actions themselves were now much simpler. There was something meditative about these morning rituals, performed without the assistance of ladies-in-waiting or the elaborate protocols that had once governed every aspect of her day. She moved to the small washstand that stood against one wall of her cell. The basin was simple earthenware, nothing like the delicate porcelain that had once graced her private chambers, but it held clean water that reflected the morning light from the window. She had learned to appreciate the luxury of clean water, something that had always been available to her at Versailles, but which she now understood was not a given for everyone. The act of washing her face and hands had become a quiet ceremony, performed slowly and mindfully. The water was cool against her skin, and she found herself grateful for this simple pleasure. At Versailles, her morning toilette had been an elaborate affair, with multiple attendants and dozens of different preparations and powders. Now, with just water and a simple cloth, she found that the essential purpose, cleanliness and refreshment, was achieved just as well. Her hair, once elaborately styled and powdered according to the fashion of the court, was now simply arranged and natural in color. The absence of powder and elaborate styling had revealed its true texture and shade, and she had discovered that she quite liked its natural state. There was something honest about it, something that connected her to the person she had been before becoming queen, before the weight of ceremony and expectation had settled on her shoulders. She had brought with her to the conciergerie a small mirror, nothing elaborate, just a simple piece of glass in a plain frame. When she looked into it now, she saw a face that was familiar yet changed. The soft living at Versailles had given way to a more austere existence, and the effect was visible in the sharper lines of her face, the more pronounced cheekbones. But there was also something else, a clarity in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of peace that came from having stripped away all the non-essential elements of life. The morning light revealed the texture of everything around her with unusual clarity: the rough stone of the walls, the simple weave of her woolen shawl, the grain of the wooden table, all of these ordinary surfaces seemed to have their own quiet beauty when observed with attention. She had time now for this kind of observation, time to notice things that had been overlooked in the rush and ceremony of court life. From her window she could see that the day was going to be fair. The sky was clear, with just a few white clouds drifting slowly across the blue. October in Paris could be unpredictable, but this morning promised to be one of those perfect autumn days when the air is crisp and the light has a particular quality that makes everything seem sharper and more defined. She had always loved autumn, even at Versailles. It was the season when the gardens showed their most subtle beauty, when the leaves turned colors that seemed to glow from within, when the air carried the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter's rest. The view from her cell window didn't include gardens or colorful leaves, but she could sense the season in the quality of the light and the feel of the air that drifted through the bars. The sounds of the prison were becoming more pronounced as the day progressed. She could hear the guards beginning their rounds, their footsteps echoing in the stone corridors. These sounds had become as familiar to her as the sounds of Versailles had once been, the rustle of silk gowns, the click of heels on marble floors, the murmur of courtiers' voices. Now it was the scrape of keys, the heavy tread of boots, the occasional slam of a door. But even these harsher sounds had their own rhythm, their own predictability that brought a kind of comfort. She had learned to find peace in small things. The way the morning light moved across the fellow of her cell, creating a natural sundial that marked the passage of time. The sound of birds calling to each other in the distance, their voices carrying news of the world beyond these walls. The texture of the simple bread that would soon be brought for her breakfast, honest food that satisfied hunger without pretense or decoration. There was something to be said for this simplicity. At Versailles every meal had been a performance, every outfit a statement, every interaction governed by complex rules of precedence and protocol. Now, eating was simply eating, dressing was simply dressing, and conversation, when it occurred, was simply the exchange of words between human beings. The elaborate machinery of court life had been stripped away, leaving behind only the essential elements of human existence. She found herself thinking about her children, as she often did during these quiet morning hours. Where were they now? Were they safe? Were they thinking of her? The uncertainty was difficult, but she had learned to hold her concern for them gently, like a prayer, rather than letting it consume her with worry. They were in God's hands, as she was, and that knowledge brought a kind of peace that all her former power and wealth had never provided. The morning routine included time for prayer, though it was private and simple now, quite different from the elaborate religious ceremonies that had been part of court life. She prayed for her family, for France, for understanding and forgiveness. The prayers were offered quietly, without ceremony or witness, and there was something pure about this private communion that felt more authentic than all the public displays of piety that had been expected of her as queen. Time moved differently in the conciergerie than it had at Versailles. There, every moment had been scheduled, every hour filled with appointments and obligations. Here, time stretched out in longer, quieter intervals. She had learned to appreciate this slower pace, to find richness in the space between events rather than in the events themselves. The light was now strong enough to illuminate the entire cell, revealing every detail of her simple surroundings. The stone walls had their own character, marked by the passage of time and the presence of all the people who had occupied this space before her. She had wondered sometimes about those previous occupants, who they were, what they had done, what they had thought about during their own quiet morning hours. And so the morning of October 14th continued to unfold, marked by simple rituals and quiet observations, by the gentle movement of light and shadow, by the basic human activities that connect us all regardless of our circumstances. Marie Antoinette, former Queen of France, faced this day as she had faced all the days of her imprisonment, with dignity, with grace, and with an appreciation for the small beauties that remained available to her even in the most constrained circumstances. The conciergerie had its own rhythm, quite different from the elaborate choreography of Versailles, but a rhythm nonetheless. Marie Antoinette had learned to read the subtle signs that marked the passage of time in this stone fortress that had become her world. The changing of the guard, the delivery of meals, the brief periods when other prisoners were moved through the corridors, all of these events created a pattern that gave structure to her days. She could hear the guards now, their voices carrying through the thick walls as they discussed the day's duties. Their conversations were mundane. Talk of the weather, of their families, of small concerns that had nothing to do with the grand politics that had brought her to this place. There was something oddly comforting about these ordinary exchanges, reminders that even in the midst of revolutionary upheaval, people still worried about everyday things, still found ways to connect with each other through simple human conversation. The guard who usually brought her breakfast was a middle-aged man named Francois, though she had learned his name only through overhearing conversations, rather than through any formal introduction. He was not unkind, though he maintained the professional distance required by his position. When he brought her meals, he would nod respectfully, and ensure that she had everything she needed, but their exchanges were brief and formal. Still, there was something in his manner that suggested he saw her as a person, rather than merely as a prisoner, and she was grateful for that small dignity. This morning, as expected, Francois arrived with her breakfast. The food was simple, a piece of bread, some cheese and water, but it was clean and fresh, and she received it with quiet gratitude. She had learned not to expect the elaborate meals that had once been prepared for her at Versailles, with their multiple courses and careful presentations. This simple fare served its purpose, and she had discovered that when hunger was honest, even the plainest food could be satisfying. She ate slowly, mindfully, paying attention to the texture of the bread and the taste of the cheese. At Versailles, meals had often been rushed affairs, interrupted by the constant demands of court life. Now she had time to actually experience the food, to appreciate it for what it was, rather than simply consuming it as part of a larger social ritual. The water was particularly welcome. It was clean and cool, and she drank it slowly, feeling it refresh her after the night's sleep. Water, she had learned, was one of life's most basic and essential pleasures. At Versailles, she had been accustomed to wine with her meals, to elaborate beverages prepared by skilled servants. But there was something pure about simple water, something that connected her to the most fundamental needs of human existence. After breakfast, she returned to her seat by the window, where she could watch the small section of the courtyard that was visible from her cell. The activity there was limited. Occasionally a guard would cross the space, or a bird would land on the cobblestones looking for scraps of food. But even these small movements provided a connection to the world beyond her immediate surroundings, a reminder that life continued beyond these walls. The morning light was now fully developed, casting clear shadows and illuminating the textures of everything it touched. She had become something of a connoisseur of light during her time in the conciergerie, noticing the way it changed throughout the day, the way it revealed different aspects of her surroundings at different times. In the morning it was clean and fresh, making even the rough stone walls seem somehow beautiful. By afternoon, it would be warmer and more golden, and in the evening, it would fade gradually, creating a sense of peace and closure. She had brought with her a few personal items when she was moved to the conciergerie: a small book of prayers, a simple piece of needlework, and a miniature portrait of her children. These objects had become precious to her, not because of their material value, but because they connected her to the parts of her life that had been most meaningful. The prayer book provided comfort and guidance, the needlework gave her something to do with her hands, and the portrait reminded her of the love that had made all the ceremonies and obligations of royal life worthwhile. The needlework was particularly soothing. It was a simple piece, a small handkerchief that she was embroidering with basic stitches. At Versailles, her needlework had been elaborate, guided by skilled teachers and executed with the finest materials. This piece was different, simpler, more personal, created entirely by her own hands without assistance or instruction. There was something satisfying about the repetitive motion of the needle, the gradual emergence of the pattern, the way the thread caught the light as she worked. She had learned to find meditation in these simple activities, the rhythm of the needle moving in and out of the fabric, the careful attention required to keep the stitches even, the slow progress toward completion. All of these elements combined to create a sense of peace and accomplishment that was quite different from the elaborate projects that had once filled her days at court. The morning progressed quietly, marked by the subtle changes in light and shadow, by the distant sounds of prison life, by the simple activities that filled her time. She had learned to appreciate the luxury of solitude, something that had been rare in her life as queen. At Versailles, she had been constantly surrounded by people, attendants, courtiers, visitors, family members. Privacy had been a scarce commodity, available only in carefully carved out moments. Now, she had hours of solitude each day, and she had discovered that it was a gift rather than a burden. The solitude allowed her to think clearly, to sort through the experiences of her life without the constant interruption of social obligations. She found herself remembering things she had forgotten, appreciating experiences that had been overshadowed by the demands of royal duty. The quiet conversations with her children, the early morning walks in the gardens of the Petit Trianon, the simple pleasure of reading a book without interruption, these memories had taken on new value in the calm of her current circumstances. She had also learned to appreciate the sound of silence. At Versailles, there had always been noise, the rustle of silk, the click of heels, the murmur of conversation, the sound of musicians practicing in distant rooms. The silence of the conciergerie had been difficult at Effiorest, but she had grown to value it. In silence, she could hear her own thoughts clearly, could listen to the subtle sounds that were usually drowned out by the bustle of activity. And so the morning of October 14th continued to unfold in its quiet rhythm, marked by simple activities and gentle observations, by the play of light and shadow on stone walls, by the basic human activities that provide structure and meaning to existence regardless of circumstances. Marie Antoinette, finding peace in simplicity, approached the day with the same grace and dignity that had characterized her life, adapted now to very different circumstances, but fundamentally unchanged. As the morning light settled into its steady rhythm across the stone floor of her cell, Marie Antoinette found her thoughts drifting back to Versailles, as they often did during these quiet hours. The memories came not as sharp pangs of loss, but as gentle recollections of beauty and meaning that had shaped her life for so many years. The contrast between her current surroundings and the opulence of the palace was striking, but she had learned to hold these memories lightly, appreciating them for what they had been, rather than mourning what was lost. She remembered the morning routine at Versailles, so different from the simple rituals that now marked her days. The lever had been an elaborate ceremony, with dozens of attendants and a precise protocol that governed every movement. The room would fill with ladies in waiting, each with their specific duties, and the process of dressing would take hours. There had been the selection of the gown, the arrangement of the hair, the application of powder and perfume, the careful placement of jewelry. Each element had been chosen not just for beauty, but for its symbolic meaning, its appropriateness for the day's activities, its place in the complex visual language of court life. She had sometimes felt like a living doll during those morning ceremonies, dressed and arranged by others, according to rules she had not created. But there had also been moments of genuine beauty. The way the morning light would stream through the tall windows of her chambers, illuminating the silk and gold thread of her gowns, the careful artistry of the hairdressers and seamstresses, the pleasure of wearing truly beautiful things created by skilled craftsmen. The gowns themselves had been works of art. She remembered one in particular, a dress of pale blue silk with delicate silver embroidery that seemed to shimmer and move in the light. The fabric had been woven by the finest silk makers in Lyon, the embroidery executed by master craftsmen who had spent months on the intricate details. When she wore it, she had felt transformed, elevated by the beauty of the garment and the skill of its creation. But now, sitting in her simple prison dress, she found herself thinking not so much about the elaborate gowns themselves, but about the quiet moments between the ceremonies. The early morning hours when she would steal away to her private sitting room, still in her simple night dress, to read or write letters by the window. The way the light would fall across the pages of her book, the sound of birds singing in the gardens outside, the sense of peace that came from these unscheduled moments of solitude. She had always been drawn to the gardens at Versailles. The formal gardens designed by Lenorta were magnificent, with their geometric patterns and carefully controlled beauty, but it was the more intimate spaces that had captured her heart. The Petit Trianon, with its smaller scale and more natural style, had become her refuge from the formality of court life. There she could walk among flowers that seemed to grow freely, sit by the small stream that wound through the grounds, and feel connected to the natural world in a way that the elaborate ceremonies of the palace rarely allowed. The memory of those gardens brought a particularly gentle warmth to her thoughts. She could almost smell the roses that had bloomed along the pathways, could almost hear the sound of water flowing over stones in the artificial stream. The gardens had been designed to look natural, but they had been carefully crafted by skilled gardeners who understood how to create beauty that seemed effortless. There had been a lesson in that, she thought now. The most beautiful things often appeared simple on the surface, but they required skill and care to create. She had spent many hours in those gardens, sometimes alone, sometimes with her children. The children had loved the less formal spaces, where they could run and play without worrying about disrupting the careful arrangements of the more formal areas. She remembered their laughter echoing across the lawns, their delight in finding new flowers, or watching the fish in the ornamental ponds. Those moments had been precious to her, times when she could simply be a mother rather than a queen, when the natural affection between parent and child could express itself without the constraints of court protocol. The meals at Versailles had been elaborate affairs, quite different from the simple bread and cheese that now sustained her. She remembered the grand dining room, with its long table set with the finest china and crystal, the elaborate centerpieces that were works of art in themselves, the carefully choreographed service that brought dish after dish in perfect sequence. The food had been prepared by skilled chefs who understood not just cooking but the art of presentation, creating dishes that were as beautiful to look at as they were delicious to eat. But even in the midst of all that abundance, she had sometimes longed for simpler fare. She remembered sneaking away to the kitchens as a young woman, fascinated by the bustle of activity there, the honest work of preparing food, the pleasure that the servants took in creating something nourishing and satisfying. The kitchen staff had been initially shocked by her presence, but they had warmed to her genuine interest in their work, and she had learned much from watching them. The music at Versailles had been another source of joy. The court musicians were among the finest in Europe, and evening concerts in the palace halls had been experiences of transcendent beauty. She remembered the way the music would fill the elaborately decorated rooms, the way the sound would seem to make the gold and crystal shimmer with its own light. The harpsichord pieces she had loved particularly. Their delicate complexity had seemed to match the intricate beauty of the palace itself. She had played the harpsichord herself, though not with the skill of the court musicians. But there had been pleasure in the simple act of making music, in the way the notes would follow from her fingers, in the sense of creating something beautiful in the moment. The instrument in her private chambers had been a particularly fine one, with an elaborate case decorated with pastoral scenes, but it was the music itself that had brought her joy, not the ornate decoration. The library at Versailles had been another refuge. The room itself was magnificent, with its tall shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, its comfortable chairs placed to catch the best light, its atmosphere of quiet scholarship. She had spent many hours there, reading everything from philosophy to poetry to the latest novels. The books had been windows into other worlds, other ways of thinking, other experiences of human existence. In the quiet of the library, she had been able to explore ideas and emotions that had no place in the formal ceremonies of court life. These memories came to her now not as sources of sadness, but as treasures to be appreciated. They reminded her of the beauty that human beings were capable of creating, the joy that could be found in art and music and well-crafted objects. The circumstances of her life had changed dramatically, but the capacity for appreciation, for finding meaning in beauty, remained unchanged. And perhaps, in some ways, the simplicity of her current situation allowed her to appreciate these memories more clearly, freed from the obligations and constraints that had sometimes made it difficult to fully experience the beauty that surrounded her at Versailles. As the morning gave way to afternoon, the light in Marie Antoinette's cell shifted to a warmer, more golden tone. The harsh clarity of the morning had softened into something more gentle, more forgiving. She had learned to appreciate these subtle changes in the quality of light, the way they marked the passage of time and created different moods throughout the day. The afternoon light seemed to make everything in her simple surroundings appear softer, more peaceful. She had moved from her seat by the window to the small wooden table where she kept her few personal belongings. The needlework she had been working on lay spread before her, the delicate threads catching the afternoon light. She picked up the needle and resumed her work, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of the stitches. Each small movement of the needle was deliberate and careful, requiring just enough attention to keep her focused on the present moment while allowing her mind to drift gently among her thoughts. The pattern she was creating was simple but meaningful to her, a small border of flowers and leaves that reminded her of the gardens she had loved at Versailles. The stitches were not as fine as those she had been capable of in her younger days, when her eyesight had been sharper and her fingers more nimble, but they were honest work, created entirely by her own hands. There was something satisfying about the gradual emergence of the pattern, the way the design became clearer with each completed section. The afternoon brought different sounds to the conciergerie. The morning had been marked by the changing of the guard and the delivery of meals, but the afternoon had its own rhythm. She could hear the distant sounds of the city beyond the prison walls, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones, the calls of street vendors, the general hum of human activity that marked a city going about its daily business. These sounds reminded her that life continued beyond these walls, that people were going about their ordinary activities, buying and selling, working and resting, living their lives in the same fundamental patterns that had existed for centuries. The afternoon meal, when it came, was as simple as the mornings had been. A bowl of thin soup, a piece of bread, more water to drink. The soup was warm and provided comfort beyond its nutritional value. She ate it slowly, savouring the warmth and the simple flavours. At Versailles, the afternoon had often brought elaborate refreshments, delicate pastries and fine wines, exotic fruits and elaborate confections. But there was something to be said for the honesty of simple food, for nourishment that made no pretense to be anything other than what it was. She had been thinking lately about the nature of luxury and what it truly meant. At Versailles, she had been surrounded by objects of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship, furniture inlaid with precious woods and metals, tapestries woven with gold thread, paintings by master artists, porcelain so fine it was almost transparent. These things had been beautiful, and she had appreciated them for their artistry and skill. But she had learned that true luxury might be something different, the luxury of time to think, of space to be alone with one's thoughts, of freedom from the constant demands of social obligation. The afternoon light revealed the texture of everything around her with particular clarity. The grain of the wooden table, the weave of her simple dress, the irregularities in the stone walls, all of these ordinary surfaces had their own character, their own quiet beauty when observed with attention. She had always been someone who noticed details, but the slower pace of her current life had allowed her to develop this capacity for observation even further. She found herself thinking about the letters she had written during her time in the conciergerie. The act of writing had always been important to her. It was a way of organizing her thoughts, of maintaining connection with the people she loved, of expressing herself in words when speech was constrained by circumstance. The letters she wrote now were different from the formal correspondence that had been part of her duties as queen. They were more personal, more direct, written from the heart rather than from obligation. The paper she had been given was simple, quite different from the elegant stationery she had once used. But paper was paper, and words were words, and the essential function, the communication of thoughts and feelings from one person to another, remained unchanged. She had written to her children, to her sister-in-law, to friends who she hoped might still remember her with kindness. Some of these letters had been delivered, others had not, but the act of writing them had been important regardless of their destination. She had been reading her prayer book again, as she did most afternoons. The words were familiar, but she found that they spoke to her differently now than they had in the past. The prayers about patience and acceptance had new meaning. The passages about finding peace in difficult circumstances resonated with her current experience. The book itself was small and simply bound, quite different from the elaborate devotional texts she had once owned, but the words inside were the same, and their power to comfort and guide remained unchanged. The afternoon brought a particular quality of quiet to the conciergerie. The morning had been marked by activity and movement, but the afternoon settled into a deeper stillness. She could hear the distant sounds of the city, but they seemed muffled by the thick walls, creating a sense of peaceful isolation. This was the time of day when she often found herself most reflective, most aware of the passage of time and the preciousness of each moment. She had been thinking about forgiveness, both asking for it and offering it. There were things she regretted from her time as queen, decisions she wished she had made differently, opportunities for kindness that she had missed. But there were also grievances she had held, resentments that had seemed important at the time, but which now appeared petty and unnecessary. The quiet of the afternoon seemed to encourage this process of reflection and release, this gentle letting go of burdens that served no useful purpose. The light was beginning to change again, moving toward the golden quality that marked the late afternoon. Soon it would be evening, and the day would begin its gradual transition toward night. She had learned to appreciate the entire cycle of the day, from the fresh clarity of morning through the warm abundance of afternoon, to the gentle peace of evening. Each part of the day had its own gifts, its own particular quality of light and mood. And so the afternoon of October 14th continued to unfold in its quiet rhythm, marked by simple activities and gentle observations, by the gradual changes in light and shadow, by the basic human activities that provide meaning and structure to existence. Marie Antoinette, finding peace in simplicity, approached each hour with the same grace and dignity that had characterized her life, adapted now to circumstances she could never have imagined, but facing them with courage and quiet faith. As the afternoon light continued its gentle progression across the stone floor of her cell, Marie Antoinette found her thoughts turning, as they often did, to her family. The miniature portrait of her children lay on the small table before her, catching the warm light that filtered through the barred window. She picked it up carefully, holding it in both hands as she studied the familiar faces that had been captured by the artist's skill. The portrait showed her children as they had been several years ago: Marie-Thérèse, her daughter, with her serious expression and careful posture, and Louis-Charles, her son, with his bright eyes and boyish smile. The artist had captured something essential about each of them, the particular quality that made them unique and precious to her. Looking at their faces now, she could almost hear their voices, could almost feel their presence in the room with her. She remembered the day the portrait had been painted. It had been a formal session, with the children dressed in their finest clothes, standing very still while the artist worked. Marie-Thérèse had been particularly good at remaining motionless, understanding even at her young age the importance of the occasion. Louis-Charles had been more restless, as children often are, but he had tried his best to cooperate, earning gentle praise from his mother for his efforts. The artist had worked with remarkable patience, taking breaks when needed to allow the children to rest and move about. During these intervals, Marie Antoinette had talked quietly with her son and daughter, telling them stories or asking about their lessons to help them stay relaxed and engaged. She had wanted the portrait to capture not just their physical appearance but something of their spirits, their essential selves that she loved so dearly. Now, holding the finished portrait in her hands, she marveled at how well the artist had succeeded. The painting was small enough to be easily concealed, but large enough to show the children's faces clearly. The colors had been chosen carefully, soft blues and whites that complemented their fair complexions, with touches of gold that caught the light beautifully. The background was simple but elegant, suggesting the refined surroundings of their life at Versailles, without overwhelming the central focus on the children themselves. She thought about Marie-Thérèse, her daughter, who had always been a serious and thoughtful child. Even as a young girl, she had shown signs of the strength and dignity that would serve her well in the difficult years to come. Marie-Thérèse had been devoted to her studies, showing particular aptitude for languages and history. She had learned to speak German fluently, honoring her mother's Austrian heritage, and had shown genuine interest in the complexities of European politics and relationships. The bond between mother and daughter had been particularly strong. Marie-Thérèse had seemed to understand intuitively the pressures and responsibilities that came with royal position, and she had often sought to comfort her mother during difficult times. There had been moments when Marie Antoinette had looked at her daughter and seen reflections of her own childhood, her own struggles to understand the complex world of court politics and social expectations. She remembered the quiet conversations they had shared, often in the evenings when the formal ceremonies of the day were complete. Marie-Thérèse had been curious about everything, about her grandmother, the Empress Maria Theresa, about life in Austria, about the customs and traditions that had shaped her mother's early years. These conversations had been precious to Marie Antoinette, opportunities to share her own history and heritage with the next generation. Louis-Charles, her son, had brought a different kind of joy to her life. Where Marie-Thérèse was serious and thoughtful, Louis-Charles was energetic and curious, full of questions about the world around him. He had been fascinated by the mechanical workings of things: clocks, carriages, the complex systems that made palace life function smoothly. His tutors had reported that he showed particular aptitude for mathematics and engineering, subjects that had surprised some members of the court who expected royal children to focus primarily on languages and diplomatic skills. The boy had inherited his father's genuine interest in the welfare of common people. Even as a young child, he had asked thoughtful questions about the lives of the servants, the conditions of the poor, the responsibilities that came with royal privilege. These conversations had filled Marie Antoinette with hope for the future, suggesting that her son would grow into a ruler who truly understood the needs of his people. She remembered the games they had played together, the stories she had told him at bedtime, the way his face would light up when she entered the nursery. Louis-Charles had been affectionate and demonstrative, qualities that had sometimes concerned court officials, who believed royal children should be trained from an early age to maintain proper dignity and reserve. But Marie Antoinette had encouraged his natural warmth, believing that the capacity for genuine human connection was more important than rigid adherence to protocol. The children's education had been a matter of constant concern and planning. Marie Antoinette had wanted them to receive the finest instruction available, but she had also wanted their education to be balanced and humane. She had insisted on tutors who understood how to make learning enjoyable, who could inspire curiosity rather than simply demanding memorization. The children had studied history, literature, mathematics, music, and languages, but they had also been encouraged to develop their own interests and talents. Music had been particularly important in their household. Both children had shown aptitude for various instruments, and family evenings often included impromptu concerts where each member would contribute a song or a piece. Marie-Thérèse had developed considerable skill on the harpsichord, while Louis-Charles had shown talent for singing, and had begun learning the violin. These musical interludes had been some of the most relaxed and joyful times in their family life. The children had also been taught to appreciate art and beauty in all its forms. Regular visits to the palace's art collections had been part of their education, with detailed discussions about the techniques and meanings of various works. They had learned to recognize the styles of different artists, to understand the historical contexts in which masterpieces had been created, and to develop their own aesthetic sensibilities. Marie Antoinette had been particularly careful to ensure that her children understood their Austrian heritage. She had taught them about the Habsburg family history, about the complex relationships between European royal houses, about the cultural traditions that had shaped their ancestry. This education had been both practical and sentimental. Practical because such knowledge was essential for their future roles, sentimental because it helped maintain the connections to her homeland that remained important to her. The religious education of the children had also been a priority. They had been raised in the Catholic faith, with regular instruction in theology and religious history. But Marie Antoinette had wanted their faith to be more than mere adherence to doctrine. She had encouraged them to develop a personal relationship with their beliefs, to find comfort and guidance in prayer and reflection. The family had attended Mass together regularly, and the children had been taught to participate meaningfully in the ceremonies rather than simply going through the motions. As she sat in her cell now, holding their portrait, Marie Antoinette felt a deep sense of gratitude for the years she had been able to spend with her children. The time had been precious beyond measure, filled with the ordinary joys and challenges of parenthood that transcended royal status. She had been present for their first steps, their first words, their early struggles with lessons and friendships. She had comforted them during childhood illnesses, celebrated their achievements, and guided them through the confusions and discoveries of growing up. The separation from her children was perhaps the most difficult aspect of her current situation. She wondered how they were managing, whether they were being treated kindly, whether they remembered the lessons she had tried to teach them about courage and dignity in the face of adversity. She hoped that the love she had shown them, the values she had tried to instill, would provide them with strength and guidance in the difficult times they were surely facing. She thought about the letters she had written to them from prison, not knowing if they would ever be delivered. In these letters, she had tried to convey all the love and wisdom she could, to provide them with guidance for the challenges they would face. She had written about the importance of forgiveness, about maintaining hope even in the darkest circumstances, about the enduring power of family bonds that could not be broken by physical separation. Her thoughts turned to her husband, Louis XVI, and the deep affection that had grown between them over the years of their marriage. Their relationship had not begun as a romantic love story. It had been an arranged marriage designed to strengthen the alliance between France and Austria. But what had started as a diplomatic arrangement had developed into something much deeper and more meaningful. Louis had been a gentle and thoughtful man, perhaps not naturally suited to the demands of absolute monarchy, but genuinely concerned with the welfare of his people. He had faced enormous challenges during his reign, navigating the complex political and economic crises that had ultimately led to revolution. Marie Antoinette had come to deeply admire his integrity, his refusal to compromise his principles, even when doing so might have been politically advantageous. The early years of their marriage had been marked by uncertainty and adjustment. Both had been young and inexperienced, thrust into roles of enormous responsibility while still learning to know each other as individuals. The pressures of court life, the constant scrutiny of their every action, the weight of expectation from both their families and their subjects. All of these had created challenges that few couples ever had to face. But gradually, through shared experiences and mutual support, they had developed a partnership based on genuine respect and affection. Louis had come to rely on Marie Antoinette's intelligence and insight, particularly in matters involving foreign relations where her Austrian connections provided valuable perspective. She had learned to appreciate his careful, methodical approach to governance, his genuine desire to do what was best for France even when the path forward was unclear. Their private moments together had been precious to both of them. Away from the formal ceremonies and public appearances, they had been able to simply be husband and wife, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams for their children and their country. Louis had been a devoted father, taking genuine pleasure in time spent with Marie-Thérèse and Louis Charles, involving himself in their education and upbringing in ways that were unusual for royal fathers of that era. The political crises that had marked the later years of Louis's reign had tested their relationship in ways they could never have anticipated. The pressures of revolution, the constant threat of violence, the agonizing decisions about when to compromise and when to stand firm, all of these had created strains that would have broken many marriages, but their shared commitment to their family and their country had kept them united even in the darkest times. Marie Antoinette remembered the last time she had seen her husband, the final moments they had shared before his execution. Even in that terrible situation, he had been concerned primarily with her welfare and that of their children. His final words to her had been expressions of love and encouragement, urging her to be strong and to maintain hope for the future. The memory of his courage in those final moments continued to inspire her own determination to face whatever lay ahead with dignity and grace. She thought about the home they had created together, not just the grand palaces and formal apartments, but the quieter, more intimate spaces where they had lived as a family. The private dining room where they had shared simple meals together, the library where they had read to each other in the evenings, the gardens where they had walked and talked about their hopes and plans. These domestic moments had been the foundation of their relationship, the ordinary experiences that had created extraordinary bonds. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the stone floor of her cell. Marie Antoinette carefully placed the portrait of her children back on the table, positioning it so that it would catch the morning light when it returned. The simple act of looking at their faces, of remembering the love they had shared, had brought her comfort and strength for another day. The gentle evening, as the day slowly transitioned toward evening, the light in Marie Antoinette's cell grew softer and more golden. The harsh angles of the morning sun had given way to a more gentle illumination that seemed to wrap around the simple furnishings with a warm embrace. She had always been sensitive to the changing qualities of light throughout the day, and she had learned to appreciate how each phase brought its own particular beauty and mood. The evening meal, when it arrived, was as simple as those that had come before, a bowl of soup, still warm from the kitchen, accompanied by bread and water. The soup was made from vegetables and grains, humble ingredients that had been transformed by careful cooking into something nourishing and comforting. She ate slowly, savoring not just the taste but the warmth that spread through her body, the simple pleasure of satisfying hunger with honest food. The guard who brought her meal was different from the ones she had seen earlier in the day. This one was older, with grey hair and weathered hands that spoke of years of hard work. He set the tray down gently on the small table, his movements careful and respectful. There was something in his manner that suggested he took no pleasure in her imprisonment, that he was simply fulfilling his duties with as much humanity as his position allowed. "Merci," she said quietly, using the same simple courtesy she would have offered to any servant. The guard nodded slightly in acknowledgement, a small gesture that somehow managed to convey both respect and sympathy. These tiny moments of human connection had become precious to her, reminders that even in the most constrained circumstances, people could still choose to treat each other with dignity. After the guard had left, Marie Antoinette returned to her needlework, taking advantage of the last good light of the day. The pattern she was creating continued to emerge with each careful stitch, a border of roses and leaves that reminded her of the gardens at Versailles. The work was painstaking, requiring concentration and patience, but it provided a sense of purpose and accomplishment that helped structure her days. The roses in her needlework were simplified versions of the elaborate blooms she remembered from the palace gardens. Working with limited materials and simple techniques, She could not recreate the complex beauty of those magnificent flowers, but she could capture something of their essence, their basic form and graceful proportions. Each rose took many hours to complete, but the gradual progress was satisfying in a way that the grand but fleeting pleasures of court life had never been. As she worked, she thought about the skilled craftspeople who had created the beautiful objects that had surrounded her at Versailles, the furniture makers who had shaped and inlaid precious woods, the silk weavers who had created tapestries of extraordinary complexity, the goldsmiths who had crafted vessels and ornaments of remarkable delicacy. She had always appreciated fine craftsmanship, but she understood now, in a way she had not before, the satisfaction that came from creating something beautiful with one's own hands. The needle she used was simple steel, quite different from the elaborate gold and silver implements she had once owned, but it served its purpose perfectly, drawing the colored threads through the fabric with precision and reliability. There was something honest about the simplicity of the tool, something that connected her to generations of women who had found solace and purpose in similar work. The threads she used were of good quality, despite the simplicity of her circumstances. Someone had taken care to provide her with materials that would allow her to create something beautiful, a small kindness that had not gone unnoticed. The colors were muted compared to the brilliant dyes that had been available to her in the past, but they were pleasing in their own way, creating a soft harmony that was restful to the eye. As the light continued to fade, Marie Antoinette set aside her needlework and moved to the window. The view from her cell was limited, but she could see a small section of the courtyard, and beyond that, glimpses of the buildings that surrounded the conciergerie. The evening light was painting everything in warm tones, transforming even the austere architecture into something more beautiful and welcoming. The sounds of the city were changing with the approach of evening. The busy activities of the day were giving way to quieter pursuits. She could hear the distant sound of church bells marking the hour, a reminder of the rhythm of religious observance that continued despite the political upheaval of the times. The bells had always been part of the fabric of French life, and their familiar tones brought a sense of continuity and peace. She thought about the evening routines that had once structured her days at Versailles. The formal ceremonies of the court had created a predictable rhythm, with specific activities and obligations for each part of the day. The evening had brought different kinds of gatherings, intimate dinners with close friends, musical performances in the private apartments, quiet conversations in the gardens as the sun set over the elaborate parterres. The evening toilette had been one of the most complex ceremonies of the day, involving dozens of attendants and an elaborate sequence of activities. Every aspect of her dress and appearance had been carefully considered, from the choice of gown to the arrangement of her hair to the selection of jewelry. The process had taken hours, but it had also been a time for quiet conversation with her ladies-in-waiting, for discussion of the day's events and plans for the following day. Now her evening routine was much simpler. She had only the clothes she wore, and her grooming was accomplished with basic materials. But there was something to be said for the simplicity, for the freedom from the elaborate protocols that had once consumed so much time and energy. She could prepare for sleep at her own pace, without the need to accommodate the schedules and expectations of others. The evening light was fading toward dusk, and with it came a different quality of quiet. The sounds of the day were diminishing, replaced by the more subdued activities of evening. She could hear the distant sound of footsteps in the corridors, the low murmur of voices, the closing of doors as the prison settled into its nighttime routine. She had been thinking about the concept of home, and what it truly meant. At Versailles, she had been surrounded by magnificent architecture and beautiful objects, but she had sometimes felt like a visitor in her own residence, constrained by the elaborate protocols that governed every aspect of life there. The private apartments where she had lived with her family had been more comfortable, but even there, the awareness of her public role had never been completely absent. Here, in this simple cell, she had found a different kind of home, a space that was entirely her own, where she could think and feel and remember without the need to perform for others. The accommodations were sparse, but they were sufficient for her needs, and the privacy they provided was precious beyond measure. She had learned to appreciate the basic human needs for shelter, warmth, and safety in a way that her previous life had never taught her. The evening meal had been digested, and she felt the pleasant tiredness that comes at the end of a day well lived. She had accomplished what she had set out to do. She had maintained her dignity, cared for her basic needs, found beauty and meaning in simple activities, and honored the memory of those she loved through quiet reflection and prayer. As full darkness approached, she prepared for sleep with the same care and attention she had once given to the elaborate evening ceremonies at Versailles. She folded her needlework carefully, placing it where it would be safe for the next day's work. She arranged her few personal possessions neatly on the small table, ensuring that everything was in its proper place. She said her prayers, giving thanks for the day's small blessings and asking for strength and peace for the days to come. The bed was narrow and simple, quite different from the elaborate sleeping arrangements she had once known, but it was clean and adequate, and she had learned to find comfort in its simplicity. She lay down carefully, adjusting her position to accommodate the firmness of the mattress, and pulled the thin blanket up to her chin. The cell was now dark except for the faint light that filtered through the window from the courtyard beyond. The sounds of the prison had settled into the quiet rhythms of night, the distant footsteps of guards making their rounds, the occasional sound of a door closing, the general sense of a large building settling into sleep. Marie Antoinette lay quietly, her hands folded over her chest, her breathing slow and regular. She thought about the day that had passed, about the simple activities that had given it structure and meaning. The morning's prayers, the quiet breakfast, the hours of needlework, the memories of family and happier times, all of these had woven together to create a tapestry of experience that was complete and satisfying in its own way. Night prayers and peaceful reflections. As the darkness deepened around her simple cell, Marie Antoinette found herself entering the most peaceful part of her day. The evening had brought with it a sense of completion, a gentle settling into the quiet hours that would carry her towards sleep. She had always been someone who appreciated the transition from day to night, the gradual shift from activity to rest that marked the natural rhythm of human existence. The prayers she said at bedtime had become more meaningful to her during her months in the conciergerie. The words she had learned as a child, recited countless times in the elaborate chapels of Versailles, now carried a different weight and significance. Each phrase seemed to resonate with her current experience, offering comfort and guidance that felt immediately relevant to her situation. She began with the prayers her mother had taught her, the simple invocations that had been part of her bedtime routine since childhood. The familiar words came easily, worn smooth by years of repetition but still carrying their essential power to connect her with something larger than herself. These prayers had traveled with her from Austria to France, from childhood to adulthood, from the heights of royal power to the depths of imprisonment, remaining constant through all the changes and challenges of her life. The Ave Maria held particular significance for her now. The image of Mary, the mother who had suffered for her child, resonated with her own experience of maternal love and loss. The prayer's gentle rhythm and beautiful language created a sense of peace and connection that helped ease the loneliness of her situation. She recited it slowly, allowing each word to settle into her consciousness, creating a sense of calm that prepared her for sleep. She prayed for her children, as she did every night, asking for their safety and well-being, for strength to endure whatever hardships they might be facing. The prayers for Marie-Thérèse and Louis Charles were among the most heartfelt she offered, filled with all the love and concern that she could no longer express to them directly. She imagined her words somehow reaching them, providing them with the comfort and support that her physical presence could not. The prayer for her husband's soul brought both sadness and peace. She asked for his eternal rest, for forgiveness for any failings he might have had, for recognition of his genuine desire to serve his people well. The pain of his loss was still sharp, but it was tempered by gratitude for the years they had shared together and confidence in his essential goodness and integrity. She prayed for France itself, for the people who were struggling through the upheaval of revolution, for wisdom for those who now held power, for an end to the violence and uncertainty that had torn the country apart. Despite everything that had happened to her personally, she retained a deep love for the country that had been her home for so many years, and a genuine concern for the welfare of its people. The prayers for forgiveness were perhaps the most difficult, but also the most necessary. She asked for forgiveness for her own mistakes and shortcomings, for the times when she had been thoughtless or selfish, for the opportunities she had missed to do good. She also offered forgiveness to those who had wronged her, recognizing that harboring resentment would only add to her own suffering without helping anyone. As she prayed, Marie Antoinette felt a gradual releasing of the day's tensions and concerns. The act of prayer had always been important to her, but she had learnt during her imprisonment to appreciate its power to create inner peace and emotional balance. The simple act of acknowledging her dependence on something greater than herself, of expressing gratitude for whatever blessings she still possessed, helped put her troubles into perspective. The darkness outside her window was now complete, broken only by the occasional flicker of torchlight from the courtyard below. The sounds of the prison had settled into the quiet patterns of night, the steady footsteps of guards making their rounds, the distant sound of doors closing, the general hush that fell over the building as its inhabitants prepared for sleep. She thought about the thousands of people throughout Paris who were also preparing for sleep at this same moment. In grand houses and humble cottages, in comfortable beds and simple pallets, people were ending their days with the same basic human needs for rest and restoration. The circumstances of their lives might be dramatically different, but the fundamental experience of transitioning from wakefulness to sleep was universal. The bed she lay in was narrow and firm, quite different from the elaborate sleeping arrangements she had once known, but she had learned to find comfort in its simplicity, to appreciate the basic human pleasure of lying down at the end of the day and allowing her body to relax into rest. The thin blanket provided adequate warmth, and the simple pillow supported her head comfortably. She adjusted her position carefully, finding the arrangement that would be most comfortable for the night ahead. The mattress was stuffed with straw rather than the fine materials she had once known, but it was clean and adequate for her needs. She had learned to appreciate the basic necessities of life in a way that her previous existence had never taught her. The cell was now completely dark except for the faint light that filtered through the barred window. Her eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and she could make out the familiar shapes of her simple furnishings: the small table where she kept her few possessions, the chair where she sat during the day, the walls that enclosed her small world. These objects had become familiar and comforting, markers of the space that had become her home. The sounds of the night were different from those of the day. The busy activities of daytime had given way to the quieter rhythms of evening and night. She could hear the distant sound of the city settling into sleep, the occasional call of a night watchman, the gentle sounds of wind moving through the courtyards and alleys of the conciergerie. She thought about the natural world beyond the walls of her prison, the gardens and forests and fields that were also settling into the quiet of night. The flowers that closed their petals in the darkness, the birds that settled into their nests, the trees that stood silently under the stars, all of these were part of the great rhythm of day and night that connected all living things. The memory of nighttime walks in the gardens at Versailles came to her with particular clarity. She had often enjoyed walking in the evening, when the formal activities of the day were complete, and she could find a few moments of privacy and peace. The gardens had been beautiful at night, with moonlight silvering the fountains and pathways, creating a magical atmosphere that was quite different from their daytime splendor. The night-blooming flowers had been particularly enchanting: jasmine and evening primrose and night-scented stock that released their perfume into the cooling air. She had learned to identify these flowers by their scent, to appreciate the way their fragrance could transform an evening stroll into an experience of sensory pleasure and peaceful contemplation. The fountains had been especially beautiful at night, their water catching and reflecting whatever light was available, creating patterns of movement and sparkle that seemed almost magical. The sound of the water had been soothing, a gentle background music that enhanced the peacefulness of the evening air. She had often paused by the fountains during her walks, allowing their beauty and tranquility to wash over her like a blessing. Now, lying in her simple cell, she could almost hear the sound of that water, could almost smell the fragrance of those night-blooming flowers. The memories were vivid enough to provide comfort, to create a sense of connection with the beauty she had once known and loved. These memories were treasures that no one could take from her, sources of joy and peace that remained available to her even in the darkest circumstances. The quiet of the night seemed to encourage this kind of gentle reminiscence. The absence of distractions allowed her mind to wander freely among her memories, to revisit the people and places and experiences that had shaped her life. She could move at will among these recollections, choosing to focus on the moments of happiness and beauty that had illuminated her journey. She thought about the music she had heard and made, the books she had read, the conversations she had enjoyed with interesting and intelligent people. These experiences had enriched her life in ways that went far beyond their immediate circumstances. They had helped form her understanding of the world, her appreciation for human creativity and achievement, her sense of connection with the great ongoing conversation of human civilization. The education she had received, both formal and informal, had been one of the great privileges of her life. She had been taught by some of the finest minds of her era, had access to books and ideas that few people ever encountered, had opportunities to engage with art and music and literature at the highest levels. This education had not just filled her mind with knowledge, it had taught her how to think, how to appreciate beauty, how to find meaning and purpose in the complexities of human existence. Now, as she lay in the darkness of her cell, she felt grateful for every lesson learned, every book read, every conversation that had broadened her understanding. These experiences had prepared her for the challenges she now faced, had given her the inner resources to find peace and dignity, even in the most difficult circumstances. The deep hours of night. As the night deepened around the conciergerie, Marie Antoinette found herself entering the most contemplative hours of her day. The prison had settled into its nighttime rhythm, with only the occasional sound of a guard's footsteps or the distant closing of a door to break the peaceful silence. These were the hours when the boundary between wakefulness and sleep became fluid, when her mind could wander freely among her memories and thoughts. The darkness was complete now, wrapping around her like a gentle shroud. She had learned to appreciate the darkness during her months in prison, to find in it a kind of peace that was different from the harsh clarity of daylight. In the darkness, she could be completely herself, free from the scrutiny of others, able to think and feel and remember without constraint. She thought about the nature of time, and how her perception of it had changed. During her years at Versailles, time had been carefully structured and accounted for, with every hour of the day planned and filled with specific activities and obligations. The elaborate ceremonies of court life had created a rigid schedule that left little room for spontaneity or personal reflection. Now, in the simplicity of her cell, time moved at a different pace. The days had their own rhythm, marked by the arrival of meals and the changing quality of light, but within that basic structure, she had found a kind of freedom. She could spend hours in contemplation, could allow her thoughts to develop naturally without the pressure of external demands. The long hours of the night were particularly precious to her. These were the times when she felt most connected to her inner self, most able to process the experiences and emotions that daylight sometimes kept at bay. The darkness provided a kind of sanctuary, where she could examine her life with honesty and compassion, where she could find meaning in experiences that had once seemed merely difficult or confusing. She thought about the people who had shared her journey through life, the friends and family members who had provided love and support through both good times and bad. The relationships she had formed had been among the greatest treasures of her existence, sources of joy and comfort that transcended the material circumstances of her life. Her ladies-in-waiting had been more than servants. They had been companions and confidants, women who had shared the daily experiences of court life and who had provided friendship and support when she needed it most. She remembered their faces clearly, their individual personalities and quirks, the particular contributions each had made to the atmosphere of warmth and companionship that had made the formalities of court life bearable. The Princess de Lamballe had been especially dear to her, a friend whose loyalty and devotion had never wavered even in the most difficult circumstances. Their friendship had been based on genuine affection and shared interests, transcending the differences in their backgrounds and stations. The princess had been someone with whom she could be completely herself, someone who understood the pressures and challenges of her position while still seeing her as a person rather than simply a royal figure. She thought about the many conversations they had shared, the long walks in the gardens, the quiet evenings spent reading or doing needlework together. These simple activities had been the foundation of their friendship, creating bonds that had proved stronger than the political upheavals that had eventually torn their world apart. The memories of her friend brought both joy and sadness, joy for the happiness they had shared, sadness for the separation that had ultimately come between them. But even the sadness was tempered by gratitude for the time they had been able to spend together, for the love and support that had enriched both their lives. Her Austrian relatives remained vivid in her memory, particularly her mother, the Empress Maria Theresa. The Empress had been a formidable woman, skilled in the complex arts of diplomacy and governance, but she had also been a devoted mother who had taken genuine interest in the welfare and development of her children. The letters she had sent to Marie Antoinette during the early years of her marriage had been filled with practical advice and emotional support, helping her navigate the challenges of adapting to French court life. The Empress had understood the difficulties her daughter would face in her new country, the ways in which cultural differences and political pressures could create stress and uncertainty. Her guidance had been invaluable in helping Marie Antoinette understand the expectations and customs of the French court, while still maintaining her own sense of identity and purpose. The relationship with her mother had been complex, as relationships between strong-willed women often are. There had been moments of tension and disagreement, times when the Empress's advice had seemed overly cautious, or when Marie Antoinette had felt constrained by her mother's expectations. But underneath these surface difficulties had been a deep bond of love and respect that had endured throughout their lives. Now, in the quiet darkness of her cell, Marie Antoinette felt a renewed appreciation for her mother's wisdom and guidance. The lessons she had learned, sometimes reluctantly, during her youth had proved invaluable in helping her face the challenges of her adult life. The strength and dignity that had characterized her mother's approach to life had become her own resources for dealing with adversity. She thought about the cultural heritage she had inherited from Austria, the traditions and values that had shaped her understanding of the world. The Austrian court had been different from the French court in many ways, more informal in some respects, more focused on genuine achievement and merit rather than mere ceremony and display. These differences had sometimes created challenges during her early years in France, but they had also provided her with alternative perspectives that had enriched her understanding of royal responsibility and social obligation. The music and art of her homeland had remained important to her throughout her life. The Austrian composers and musicians she had known in her youth had influenced her taste and appreciation for the rest of her life. The particular style of Austrian Baroque architecture and decoration had provided a standard of beauty and elegance that she had tried to incorporate into her surroundings at Versailles. The German language, her mother tongue, had remained precious to her even after decades of speaking primarily French. In her private thoughts and prayers, she sometimes returned to the language of her childhood, finding in it a kind of comfort and authenticity that connected her to her earliest and most fundamental sense of self. The night air moved gently through the barred window of her cell, carrying with it the scents and sounds of the sleeping city. Paris at night was different from Paris during the day, quieter, more mysterious, full of shadows and hidden activities. She could smell the faint traces of wood smoke from countless fireplaces, the lingering odors of the day's cooking, the general scent of a large city settling into rest. The sounds were muted but still present, the distant call of a night watchman, the clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestones, the occasional sound of voices from the street. These sounds reminded her that life continued beyond the walls of her prison, that the great city of Paris was still alive and active even in the deep hours of the night. She thought about the other prisoners in the conciergerie, the men and women who were sharing her experience of captivity. Some she had glimpsed briefly in the corridors, others she knew only from the sounds that filtered through the walls, footsteps, voices, the occasional sound of weeping or prayer. Each of these people had their own story, their own reasons for being here, their own ways of coping with the uncertainty and fear that imprisonment brought. The knowledge that she was not alone in her suffering provided a strange kind of comfort. The shared experience of hardship created bonds between people who might otherwise have nothing in common. She had learned to feel compassion for her fellow prisoners, to include them in her prayers, to hope for their eventual release and reunion with their families. The guards who watched over them were also part of this small community of the confined. Some were harsh and unsympathetic, but others showed signs of humanity and even kindness. The older guard who had brought her evening meal had been gentle in his manner, careful not to cause unnecessary distress. These small gestures of consideration had not gone unnoticed, and they had helped maintain her faith in the basic decency of human nature. The thought of human connection, even in the most constrained circumstances, reminded her of the fundamental bonds that united all people, regardless of their station in life, their political beliefs, or their personal circumstances. Everyone shared the same basic needs for kindness, understanding, and hope. The recognition of this shared humanity had become one of the most important insights of her imprisonment. She found herself thinking about the servants who had worked at Versailles, the hundreds of people who had made the elaborate machinery of court life function smoothly. During her years as queen, she had sometimes taken their presence for granted, seeing them as part of the background of her daily existence rather than as individuals with their own hopes and dreams and challenges. But there had been moments when she had glimpsed the people behind the roles, when a conversation in the kitchen or a chance encounter in the gardens had revealed the personality and character of someone she had previously known only as a function. These interactions had been precious to her, reminders of the humanity that existed at every level of the social hierarchy. The cook who had taught her to make simple pastries during one of her visits to the kitchen had been a woman of remarkable skill and patience. She had explained not just the techniques involved, but the reasoning behind them, the ways in which different ingredients combined to create specific flavors and textures. The lesson had been both practical and philosophical, an introduction to the creativity and artistry that could be found in even the most basic human activities. The gardener who had shown her the secret workings of the elaborate parterres had been another teacher whose lessons had stayed with her. He had explained how the apparent naturalness of the gardens was actually the result of careful planning and constant maintenance, how the beauty that seemed so effortless was actually the product of knowledge and skill accumulated over generations. These encounters had taught her to appreciate the intelligence and creativity that existed at every level of society, to recognize that wisdom and insight could be found in the most unexpected places. The servants at Versailles had been more than mere workers. They had been craftsmen and artists, people who took pride in their skills and who contributed to the beauty and functionality of the world around them. The deepest hours as the night progressed toward its deepest hours, Marie Antoinette found herself entering a state of profound peace and acceptance. The darkness around her was complete and enveloping, creating a sense of safety and solitude that allowed her thoughts to flow freely without constraint. These were the hours when the boundaries between past and present seemed to dissolve, when memory and imagination could blend together in a gentle stream of consciousness. She thought about the cycles of nature that continued regardless of human affairs, the eternal rhythms of season and weather that provided a kind of stability and continuity in an uncertain world. Even here in the heart of the city, confined within stone walls, she could sense the presence of the natural world. The air that moved through her window carried traces of rain and earth, reminders of the countryside that surrounded Paris, the fields and forests that continued their ancient cycles of growth and rest. The seasons had always been important to her, marking the passage of time with their distinctive characteristics and pleasures. Spring had brought the first flowers to the gardens at Versailles, the tender green of new leaves, the sense of renewal and possibility that came with the lengthening days. She had loved to walk in the gardens during those early weeks of spring, watching as the carefully planned displays of bulbs and early flowers emerged from the dark earth. Summer had been a time of abundance and activity, with the gardens in full bloom and the court engaged in its most elaborate ceremonies and entertainments. The long days had provided ample time for outdoor activities, for picnics in the gardens, for theatrical performances in the outdoor theatres that had been built among the trees. The warm evenings had been perfect for musical entertainments, with the sound of harpsichord and voice drifting across the lawns and parterres. Autumn had brought its own particular beauty, with the changing colours of the leaves creating a tapestry of gold and crimson that rivaled any work of art. The harvest season had been celebrated with appropriate ceremonies, acknowledging the connection between the court and the agricultural cycles that sustained the kingdom. The cooler weather had been welcome after the heat of summer, providing comfortable conditions for long walks and outdoor activities. Winter had been a time of quiet beauty, with the gardens transformed by snow and ice into a different kind of landscape. The bare branches of the trees had created delicate patterns against the sky, while the frozen fountains had become sculptures of ice and crystal. The shorter days had encouraged indoor activities, with long evenings devoted to reading, music and conversation around the warmth of elaborate fireplaces. Each season had brought its own gifts and challenges, its own particular character and mood. The regular progression from one season to the next had provided a sense of order and predictability that had been comforting, a reminder that some things remained constant even when human affairs were in turmoil. Now, as she lay in her simple cell, Marie Antoinette could feel the approach of winter in the quality of the air, the particular coolness that suggested the changing season. October was a time of transition, when the abundance of summer was giving way to the quieter months of autumn and winter. The knowledge that the natural world continued its ancient rhythms, regardless of human political upheavals, provided a sense of perspective and peace. She thought about the animals that had shared the gardens at Versailles, the birds and small creatures that had made their homes among the carefully cultivated plants. There had been swans on the ornamental lakes, their graceful forms adding beauty and movement to the formal water features. The sight of these elegant birds gliding across the still water had been a source of constant pleasure, a reminder of the natural grace that could exist alongside human artistry. The songbirds that had nested in the trees and shrubs had provided a natural soundtrack to life in the gardens. Their voices had been particularly beautiful in the early morning and evening hours, when the air was cool and still. She had learned to recognize the calls of different species, to appreciate the complex melodies they created as they communicated with each other across the vast expanse of the gardens. The small creatures that had lived in the undergrowth, the rabbits and squirrels and hedgehogs, had been less visible but no less important to the ecosystem of the gardens. Occasionally she had glimpsed them during her walks, quick movements in the shadows that reminded her of the wild life that existed alongside the carefully cultivated beauty of the formal gardens. These memories of the natural world brought a sense of continuity and connection that transcended her current circumstances. The same moon that now shone through the barred window of her cell had once illuminated the gardens at Versailles. The same stars that she could glimpse through the narrow opening had looked down on all the joys and sorrows of her life. The night sky had always held a special fascination for her. During clear evenings at Versailles, she had sometimes stood on the balconies of her apartments, looking up at the vast expanse of stars and trying to comprehend the immensity of the universe. The sight had been both humbling and inspiring, a reminder of the smallness of human concerns in the context of the infinite cosmos. The constellations had been pointed out to her by various tutors and companions, and she had learned to recognize the major patterns and their associated stories. The mythology surrounding the stars had appealed to her imagination, the ancient tales of gods and heroes projected onto the night sky by generations of storytellers and astronomers. Now, lying in the darkness of her cell, she could imagine those same stars continuing their eternal dance overhead, unchanged by the political upheavals and personal tragedies that had marked her earthly existence. The thought was comforting, a reminder that there were realities beyond the immediate concerns of human life, perspectives from which even the most dramatic events appeared as brief episodes in a much larger story. The sound of her own breathing had become a kind of meditation, a steady rhythm that connected her to the most basic processes of life. Each breath was a gift, a moment of existence that she could experience fully and completely. The simple act of breathing had become a prayer in itself, an acknowledgement of the miracle of consciousness and the precious nature of each moment of awareness. She thought about the books she had read during her years at Versailles, the ideas and stories that had shaped her understanding of the world. The library had been one of her favorite retreats, a place where she could explore different perspectives and experiences through the written word. The books had been windows into other times and places, other ways of thinking and feeling that had broadened her understanding of human nature and possibility. The philosophers she had read had provided frameworks for understanding the complexities of human society and governance. Their ideas about justice, responsibility, and the relationship between rulers and subjects had influenced her thinking about her own role and obligations. Even when she had disagreed with their conclusions, their arguments had challenged her to think more deeply about the fundamental questions of human existence. The poets had offered a different kind of insight, expressing truths about love, loss, beauty, and meaning that could not be captured in prose. The music of their language had been as important as their ideas, creating emotional resonances that spoke directly to the heart. She had memorized many of her favorite poems, and their words often came to her now in the quiet hours of the night, providing comfort and inspiration. The novels she had read had been explorations of human psychology and social relationships, stories that had helped her understand the complexities of human motivation and behavior. The characters in these books had become real to her, their struggles and triumphs providing insights into the universal aspects of human experience. The approaching dawn as the night began its slow progression toward dawn, Marie Antoinette found herself entering a state of profound tranquility and acceptance. The deepest hours of darkness had passed, and while the sky beyond her window remained black, she could sense the subtle approach of morning in the quality of the air, the barely perceptible shift in the rhythm of the sleeping city around her. These pre-dawn hours had become especially precious to her during her months in the conciergerie. They were the most peaceful time of the day, when the prison was quietest and her thoughts could flow most freely. The boundary between sleep and wakefulness became fluid during these hours, allowing her to exist in a gentle twilight state where memory and meditation blended together in a stream of consciousness that was both restful and illuminating. She thought about the nature of courage and where it came from. During her years as queen, she had been called upon to display courage in many different circumstances, in facing political crises, in dealing with personal attacks, in maintaining her composure during public ceremonies even when she was struggling with private difficulties. But the courage required for her current situation was different, more fundamental and more personal. The courage she needed now was the courage to face each day with dignity and grace, to find meaning and purpose in the simplest activities, to maintain hope and faith when the future was uncertain. It was the courage to be completely herself, without the elaborate costumes and ceremonies that had once defined her public role. This kind of courage came not from external sources but from some deep inner resource that she was still discovering. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act with honor and integrity despite fear. There had been many moments during her imprisonment when she had felt afraid for her children, afraid for her own future, afraid of the unknown challenges that lay ahead. But she had found that acknowledging these fears, rather than denying them, had actually made it easier to act with courage. The example of her husband had been important to her in this regard. Louis had faced his final days with remarkable dignity and composure, maintaining his principles and his concern for others even in the face of death. His courage had not been the dramatic, heroic kind celebrated in stories and legends, but the quiet, steady courage of a person who remained true to his values regardless of the consequences. This kind of moral courage had become her model for her own behavior. She tried to treat everyone she encountered with courtesy and respect, to maintain her personal standards of conduct regardless of how others behaved toward her, to find ways to contribute positively to the small community of the prison even when her options were limited. The daily routines that had developed during her imprisonment had become expressions of this quiet courage. The care she took with her appearance, the attention she paid to her needlework, the time she devoted to prayer and reflection, all of these activities were ways of asserting her dignity and humanity in circumstances designed to strip them away. She thought about the concept of legacy and what would remain of her life after she was gone. The material possessions that had once surrounded her, the beautiful clothes, the elaborate furniture, the precious works of art, were all temporary, subject to the changing fortunes of politics and time. But the relationships she had formed, the love she had given and received, the small acts of kindness and consideration she had performed, these had a different kind of permanence. The love she had shared with her children would continue to exist in their memories and in the values she had tried to instill in them. The affection she had shown to her friends and servants would be remembered by those who had received it. The example of dignity and grace she was trying to set during her imprisonment might inspire others who faced similar challenges. These thoughts brought her a sense of peace and purpose that transcended her immediate circumstances. If her life had meaning beyond its material achievements, if her example could provide guidance or inspiration to others, then even the most difficult experiences could be understood as having value and significance. The pre-dawn hours were also a time for gratitude, for acknowledging the gifts and blessings that had enriched her life. The beauty she had been privileged to experience, the love she had received from family and friends, the opportunities she had been given to learn and grow, all of these had been precious beyond measure. Even the hardships and challenges had contributed to her development as a person, teaching her lessons about resilience, compassion, and the importance of maintaining hope in difficult circumstances. The simple pleasures that had sustained her during her imprisonment, the changing light through her window, the satisfaction of needlework, the comfort of prayer, the nourishment of humble food, had taught her to appreciate the basic elements of human existence in a way that her previous life had never allowed. This appreciation had been one of the unexpected gifts of her confinement, a reminder that happiness and contentment could be found in the simplest circumstances. She thought about the servants and common people she had known, the individuals whose lives had intersected with hers in small but meaningful ways, the kitchen maid who had shared her knowledge of cooking, the gardener who had explained the mysteries of horticulture, the guard who had shown her small kindnesses. All of these people had contributed to her understanding of human nature and the importance of treating everyone with respect and consideration. The letters she had written from prison had been attempts to maintain these human connections, to express her gratitude and affection to those who had touched her life. Whether these letters reached their intended recipients or not, the act of writing them had been important, a way of honoring the relationships that had given her life meaning and purpose. The dawn was still hours away, but she could sense its approach in the subtle ways that night begins to prepare for day. The darkness was perhaps a shade less complete, the silence a bit less profound. The city of Paris was beginning its slow awakening, the first stirrings of another day of human activity and endeavor. She thought about all the people throughout the city who were sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware of the quiet drama being played out in the cells of the conciergerie. Families were gathered safely in their homes. Children were dreaming innocent dreams. Lovers were sharing the comfort of companionship. The ordinary activities of human life continued, providing a kind of stability and continuity that transcended the political upheavals of the times. The knowledge that life continued in all its complexity and beauty, that people were still falling in love, still caring for their children, still creating works of art and music and literature, still finding ways to help and comfort each other. This knowledge provided a sense of hope and connection that sustained her through the darkest hours. As she lay in her simple bed, Marie Antoinette felt a profound sense of peace settling over her. The night had been filled with gentle memories and quiet reflections, with prayers and gratitude and acceptance. The fears and anxieties that sometimes troubled her during the day had been replaced by a deep tranquility that seemed to emanate from some inner source of strength and wisdom. The gentle return to light. As the hours of deep night began their slow transition toward dawn, Marie Antoinette found herself wrapped in the most profound peace she had experienced in many months. The darkness around her was complete but not oppressive, creating a cocoon of solitude that allowed her thoughts to flow with perfect freedom and clarity. These were the hours when time seemed to slow almost to a standstill, when each moment could be experienced fully and completely. The city of Paris beyond her window was at its quietest now, with only the most essential activities continuing through the deep hours of the night. The occasional sound of footsteps on cobblestones, the distant call of a night watchman, the soft rustle of wind through the narrow streets. These sounds were like a gentle lullaby, reminding her of the ongoing life of the city, while emphasizing the peaceful solitude of her own small space. She thought about the concept of time itself, and how her understanding of it had evolved during her imprisonment. In her previous life, time had been carefully measured and accounted for, with elaborate schedules and precise appointments governing every hour of the day. The court ceremonies had been timed to the minute, with complex protocols ensuring that every activity began and ended at exactly the right moment. Now time moved at a different pace entirely. The days were marked by simple rhythms, the arrival of meals, the changing quality of light, the basic activities of personal care and quiet reflection. Within this simple structure, she had found a kind of freedom that her previous life had never allowed. She could spend hours in contemplation without the pressure of external obligations, could allow her thoughts to develop naturally without the constant interruption of ceremonial duties. This slower pace of life had taught her to appreciate the present moment in a way that had been impossible during her years as queen. Each activity, no matter how simple, could be experienced fully and completely. The act of eating a simple meal, of working on her needlework, of saying her prayers, all of these had become opportunities for mindfulness and presence that enriched her daily experience. The concept of mindfulness had not been part of her formal education, but she had discovered it naturally during her months of imprisonment. The necessity of finding meaning and purpose in the simplest activities had taught her to pay attention to the details of immediate experience, to find beauty and significance in moments that might otherwise have passed unnoticed. The texture of the thread she used in her needlework, the play of light and shadow on the stone walls of her cell, the rhythm of her own breathing, all of these had become objects of contemplation that connected her to the fundamental processes of existence. This attention to detail had become a form of prayer, a way of acknowledging the sacred nature of ordinary experience. She thought about the concept of home and what it truly meant to her now. The elaborate palaces where she had lived had been magnificent, filled with beautiful objects and comfortable furnishings, but they had also been public spaces, where her private life was constantly subject to scrutiny and protocol. The simple cell where she now lived was Spartan by comparison, but it was entirely her own, a space where she could be completely herself without the need to perform for others. The realization that home was not primarily about physical surroundings but about inner peace and acceptance had been one of the most important insights of her imprisonment. She had learned to create a sense of home wherever she was, to find comfort and security in her own inner resources rather than depending on external circumstances. This understanding had brought her a kind of freedom that had been absent from her previous life. No matter what happened to her externally, she could maintain a sense of inner stability and peace. The simple activities that structured her days had become rituals of self-care and spiritual maintenance, ways of honoring her own dignity and worth regardless of how others might choose to treat her. The approaching dawn was still hours away, but she could sense the gradual shift in the quality of the darkness. The night was perhaps a shade less complete, the silence a bit less profound. The city of Paris was beginning its slow awakening, the first stirrings of another day of human activity and endeavor. She thought about the dawn she would not see, the mornings that would come after her own story had ended. The sun would continue to rise over Paris, the seasons would continue their eternal cycle, People would continue to fall in love and raise families and create works of beauty and meaning. The knowledge that life would continue, that the great human adventure would go on, provided a sense of comfort and continuity that transcended personal concerns. The stars that she could glimpse through the narrow window of her cell had been shining for countless centuries before her birth and would continue to shine for countless centuries after her death. This perspective, far from diminishing the importance of her individual existence, somehow enhanced it. To be a conscious being capable of contemplating the stars, to be able to appreciate beauty and love and meaning, these were extraordinary gifts that deserved to be honored and celebrated. The simple fact of consciousness itself seemed miraculous to her now. The ability to think and feel and remember, to appreciate beauty and create meaning, to love and be loved, these capacities were so remarkable that they transformed even the most ordinary experiences into something precious and significant. Her breathing had become deeper and more regular, a rhythm that seemed to connect her to the fundamental processes of life. Each breath was a gift, a moment of existence that she could experience fully and gratefully. The simple act of breathing had become a meditation, a way of acknowledging the miracle of being alive and conscious in this extraordinary universe. The memories that had filled her night, the gardens at Versailles, the faces of her children, the music and art and literature that had enriched her life, all of these had been ways of celebrating the gift of consciousness, of exploring the possibilities that existence offered to those who were willing to pay attention and remain open to experience. As the deepest hours of the night continued their slow passage, Marie Antoinette found herself entering a state of profound acceptance and peace. The struggles and sorrows of her life had not been erased, but they had been transformed into something larger and more meaningful. The love she had given and received, the beauty she had experienced and appreciated, the moments of joy and connection she had shared with others, these had created a tapestry of experience that was complete and satisfying in its own right. The future remained uncertain, but the past had been lived fully, and with as much grace and dignity as she could manage. The present moment was peaceful and serene, filled with the quiet satisfaction of a life that had been lived with intention and purpose. Whatever came next would be met with the same courage and faith that had sustained her through the challenges she had already faced. The night air moved gently through the barred window, carrying with it the scents and sounds of the sleeping city. The world continued its ancient rhythms, unchanged by the personal dramas and political upheavals that occupied so much human attention. This continuity was comforting, a reminder that there were realities beyond the immediate concerns of individual existence. The darkness was beginning its slow retreat, though dawn was still hours away. The transition from night to day would be gradual and gentle, marked by subtle changes in the quality of light and the awakening sounds of the city. But for now, the night still held its peaceful embrace, providing a sanctuary for rest and reflection that prepared the soul for whatever challenges the new day might bring. And so Marie Antoinette, once Queen of France, now simply a woman facing the unknown with courage and grace, settled into the deepest peace of the night. Her breathing slowed and deepened, her body relaxed completely, and her mind drifted gently among the memories and dreams that had sustained her through the long journey of her life. The stars continued their eternal dance overhead, the city of Paris slept peacefully around her, and the great wheel of time continued its measured rotation. In her simple cell, wrapped in the gentle darkness of the night, she found the rest and peace that had been the goal of her long day's journey toward acceptance and understanding. The last Queen of France closed her eyes and let herself drift into the gentle embrace of sleep, surrounded by the love and beauty that had filled her life, sustained by the faith and courage that had carried her through its greatest challenges, and peaceful in the knowledge that she had lived with as much dignity and grace as any human being could hope to achieve. And so we leave Marie Antoinette in the gentle hours of her final night, finding peace in memory and meaning in simplicity. As you listen to her story, let her quiet courage and graceful acceptance of life's changes inspire your own journey toward rest. Allow her gentle example to ease your mind as you settle into sleep, knowing that like her, you too can find beauty and meaning in the simplest moments of existence. Let the rhythm of her breathing guide your own as you drift toward dreams. Let the peace she found in acceptance wash over you like a gentle tide. Rest now as she rested, wrapped in the quiet dignity of a life lived fully and with purpose, surrounded by the eternal love that connects all human hearts across the centuries. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the same gentle beauty and quiet grace that marked her final hours of contemplation and peace.